everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Jude, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am thrilled to welcome you to tonight's event with James C. O'Connell, discussing his work, Boston and the Making of a Global City, in conversation with Scott Kirsner. Tonight's event will conclude with some time for your questions. Just raise your hand, and the speakers will call on you. If you haven't already, you can purchase copies of Boston and the Making of a Global City at the registers in the next room. After the presentation, there will be a signing. Just line up in front of this table and have the line extend toward the opening to the next room. We ask that you please purchase your books before bringing them over to get signed. Lastly, thank you for buying books from Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases support our award-winning event series and helps ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Finally, a quick reminder to please silence your cell phones. Now, I am pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Jim O'Connell is the author of several other books, including The Hub's Metropolis, Boston's Suburban Development from Railroad Suburbs to Smart Growth. He formerly was a planner for national park sites in New England and New York State. Jim teaches in the City Planning Urban Affairs program at Boston University and leads urban planning design tours of different areas of Boston and Cambridge. Boston and the Making of a Global City weaves the history of Boston from a low point in an economy dominated by manufacturing into a new era of globalization fueled by dramatic advances in telecommunications, computer power, air and sea travel, and intellectual capital. Jim O'Connell pulls together scholarship, media stories, personal interviews, and city planning documents to tell the story of Boston's historical trajectory as it quickly became a competitive global hub and identifies the strategy that Boston employs to confront the economic, social, and environmental challenges of the future. Scott Kirsner has spent more than 25 years working as a business journalist and contributing editor at the Boston Globe, Variety, New York Times, and more. He is a columnist for MassLive and a regular contributor on WBUR. Scott is the author of several books, including Innovation Economy, True Stories of Startups, Flameouts, and Inventing the Future in New England. Scott is a co-founder of the Innovation Trail, a nonprofit organization that tells the history of Massachusetts-based innovation. Please join me in welcoming Jim O'Connell and Scott Kirsner.
All right. Thank you, Jude, for that thorough introduction. We both appreciate it. Jim, I have to confess I was a little bit anxious because I think today is Tuesday, August 12th, and we're in Harvard Square. And I was like, who is going to show up for this event in the middle of August? But we have both your friends and supporters and fans, and we also have other people who don't own a house on Martha's Vineyard. So that's kind of what unites this audience, I think.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure, we're going to talk a little bit about the book. I have some questions, having read it, having interviewed Jim once before for MassLive about the book. But I always find that audiences, and this is a wonderfully large audience for August in Cambridge. I think they brought out every folding chair that the Harvard Bookstore owns. So apologies to those of you standing. I really would like to get to your questions pretty quickly. So Jim, I just would love to start, um, first of all, just tell us a little bit about, has there been a guiding force or a guiding light in your career? You have done economic development on Cape Cod, you've done redevelopment in Springfield, you've taught at Boston Architectural College and BU, you've written 6 books. Like, what's been the sort of thread throughout all those things?
Well, you really set me up for that one. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. When this was proposed as a night, I said, oh, geez, I don't think it would be great to have a talk until after Labor Day. So this is fantastic that many of you are interested in coming out on a hot night like tonight. So thank you. Fair question. I could just sum it up that I've always worked as a city planner. That's how I've earned my living. But I've actually written 7 books, and I've always
Sorry,
written.
This is number 7, 6
Yeah,
previous.
yeah.
Thank you.
And I've always written about places that I've lived in, whether it's the Pioneer Valley, Cape Cod, or Boston. And I'm always looking to tell stories that I think have been overlooked, that I think are really important. And I think the most relevant book is The Hub's Metropolis that I wrote about a decade ago on the planning and development of metropolitan Boston. A million books have been written on the city of Boston, but really nothing on the topic of how the region got developed, the suburbs. So that was kind of something new. Um, it's just in how things work and how cities and metropolitan areas develop. I've always been interested in the region. It isn't, if you just look at the city or the town, you're kind of missing it. You've got to get all the surrounding communities as well, because that's how we really live. So then that gets me to the current book, Boston, the Making of a Global City. And it's a kind of a different angle. And I read a lot of stuff. My field of expertise is cities, urban planning, urban history. I read a lot of these things. And at least for American cities, forget about Boston, nobody's written about American cities from the point of view, how has globalization affected this city, Boston, and how has Boston affected globalization? So I've kind of, got into a completely different topic. It was suggested to me, I don't know, a number of years ago, um, when I was teaching a course at BU on the planning and development of metropolitan Boston. And the professor said, well, you've got to include the global angle. I said, the global angle? Well, I turned it into a course. I've taught the course now 8 times. It's one of those things. I taught it 3 times, and then it was COVID 2020. And I don't know, I'm not going to say I had nothing better to do, but like a lot of people, it's like, okay, I might have a book here. And that's how I got started. So COVID kind of gave a kick to that project.
I love that. What's your definition of global city? I think when people hear those two words together, they start to think like New York, Paris, Tokyo, London.
Okay, basically the argument is this. And Boston has been in the global economy forever, going back to the 1630s. The colonial era, they had to survive. It was not a great place to do farming. They couldn't grow lots of wheat and all that sort of stuff for export. So they got involved in trade, the famous triangle trade, the rum, the slaves from Africa, which then were brought to the Caribbean to raise sugar, then to bring the sugar up here, turn to form molasses, turn into rum, trade it back, trade with Europe. So kind of Boston was very much, it was the leading city or town, if you will, in British North America until about 1750. So for its first 120 years, it was ahead of Philadelphia, ahead of New York, more important place. So it really had that. And then after the Revolution, I'm just going to give you a quick thing here, until the Civil War, it was, after New York, the leading port, and that's what really drove it. The wealth that we have, where does it come from? The China trade. Where does the money come from that goes into the industry where we started the Industrial Revolution in America, places like Lowell or Waltham? From the China trade, from this trade, China, India, Russia. So Boston was a totally global place for its first 2 centuries. I'm just giving you the kernel of it, and then becomes really oriented to a national economy after that, more industrial. And it's only the last 40 years that it really becomes an important global place again. So if you're going back even to the 50s, 60s, or into the 70s, it's not really a global city. And what happens, if I might just give the little change in the global economy, is that we get this global economy. China joins the global economy. The Soviet Union falls apart by the end of the 1980s. Free trade comes through, computers, the internet, the jet plane, and Boston comes to the fore. It's no longer built on a manufacturing economy, but now services and innovation. And that's what really brings forth Harvard and MIT. Harvard and MIT and BU, whatever, they've been around forever, but they assume a global importance starting by about the 80s. So that's a big argument, but that lays it out there.
Yeah. One of the sort of dividing points for me is kind of around 1946, so post World War II, when you have a couple Bostonians, including a Harvard Business School professor, a former president of MIT, who create basically the first venture capital firm in Boston, American Research and Development, to say like, hey, we want to fund startup companies coming out of universities, which was a new idea. They were thinking about how do we reboot the economy, a peacetime economy post World War II. So to me, that's like an interesting dividing line of, the manufacturing economy, the trade economy that you were talking about, and the economy that we all kind of live in today of biotech and software
Right.
and financial services.
Right, because that's it. In that period, you had to go to a bank, and good old Boston conservative banks, they weren't going to be funding some mad scientist out of MIT who came up with some new idea that had never been tried. And he's just looking for some startup funds. So the first venture capital enterprise in the world starts here. It's also interesting, a couple of decades earlier, The mutual fund was invented in Boston. People don't always understand how important Boston has been in the world of finance, and still is.
Your book, like in reading it, one of the things I think is interesting is you highlight a lot of these forces, including, education and building up these great universities, including immigration, and to a large extent being welcoming of people coming here from different parts of the world, and integrating them into society and into the economy. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, boy, a lot of these things feel under threat in 2025. Um, I guess my question is just, you finished writing this book, I think last year,
Yeah, I
before
turned
Trump
in the
won the election.
final around Halloween.
Yeah, yeah.
This
So a week or
represents the
two.
world as of Halloween 2024.
Yeah. So what has your read been in the first 7 or 8 months of this administration as they kind of seem to be systematically attacking a lot of the stuff you talk about in this book that have been productive and positive forces in making Boston what it is?
Well, I'm just, obviously
Not to
we
get too
could
political.
discuss it all night. Um, it is totally astonishing that hey, I have to be a little political here. You have a Republican administration that is anti-free trade. Wasn't that always the thing? Get the government off our backs, turn businesses loose. And that's the whole idea of turning universities loose, turn these intelligent people loose to kind of do research and just have them work in the world. Globalization, you would have to say, as we've known it the last 40 years, was invented by America. And now it's like globalization, trading partners, allies, people from a foreign country coming here. It's who knows. So I felt a bit bad, but I feel a little more comfortable with this book being out here now because it still is very valid to
Well,
talk
yeah,
about Boston and globalization, not just say we're in a new era and it's irrelevant.
yeah. No, I didn't mean to suggest that it was irrelevant in any way. I guess I was just asking for you to read the tea leaves a little bit in we have spent, I mean, really since 1636, you can go back to the founding of the school across the street and say
Right,
we've been investing in higher
right.
education, this knowledge economy, smart people are from all over the world are what power Boston. And just to read the tea leaves a little bit about where are we going to go next with this context where it seems like we have a government that wants to make it harder for people to come here from foreign countries, wants to make it to some extent. I'm not sure what they're doing with universities. It feels to some extent like a shakedown.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know.
Talking about like wanting to take
Yeah,
patents from universities.
yeah. I know. It's just I don't know. I mean, we could really talk about that, but I have to. I think I've kind of summed it up, um, kind of cogently, but it's just kind of astonishing that it's
Yeah.
happened.
Well, I guess I'm sort of pushing you a little bit on what are your thoughts about where we're going to go next? Like there have been, maybe you want to touch on in the book, you talk about lots of other instances where we've been in moments of crisis, where we face challenges, manufacturing
Right,
disappearing from Eastern Massachusetts and all
right,
these factories
right,
closing.
right.
Does that just lead you to believe, hey, this is a resilient place? We're going to be
Well,
resilient again?
I think you know, whatever, regardless of what the U.S. is doing, the rest of the world still wants to be globalized. China still wants it. Europe still wants it. Every other, they want to do the trade. So they're still going to be doing the innovation. They're still going to be funding more research and development. You know, China is really moving fast on this, but don't think that Europe and all these other countries aren't doing it as well. So if you're going to say, well, we are going to be into innovation, creating new goods and services, we aren't going to pay for R&D anymore. I think we were just chatting beforehand that I think there were going to be workarounds where, and I have to give Governor Healy credit for this. She's put aside $400 million to take up some of the slack to promote R&D. And the state has been very aggressive in supporting biotech now going back to the Vol Patrick, um, putting money into AI. And I think it's, I say, well, where do they put it? Part of it's just kind of supporting organizations, part of it's training people, some of it's outright grants and loans for research and enterprise. So I think that these are strong things. And hey, California's going through the same thing. If there's an important place from an innovation point of view,
Hmm.
well, they're going through it as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I guess I would observe, and I feel like I'm curious if you agree or disagree, just that like we're in a moment where like I haven't really heard anybody in, I hear people on Beacon Hill kind of having a theory of the case of like how does Massachusetts want to lead? How do we want to drive innovation in all these areas, whether it's gene editing and biotech or whether it's artificial intelligence or robotics? I'm not sure at the federal level I've heard anybody say something coherent about this is what's going to build American competitive advantage over the next
Well,
three
see,
or four
that's it.
years.
That's kind of basic. I mean, if you take economics, you kind of learn that that's, what cities are about. You can go to any city of any significance in America, never mind the world, and they're all, I worked in economic development, everybody's trying to say, how can we grow our economy? How can we do this? So look at what other places are doing. But you don't have a federal government that is touching on that at all. It's quite astonishing.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about some of the things you highlight toward the end of the book as just challenges that we need to grapple with here? I mean, one of them is, the cost of housing remains a big issue. I think you talk about income inequality. I think you talk a little bit about, the transportation infrastructure here. I don't know if you want to take them in that order or different order and tell us what your solutions are to those problems.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I've been talking about Boston and what it needs to do for 20, 25 years. And people say, well, what do we have to do for our economy? I've been saying this 20 years ago. I said, it's about housing. This is 20 years ago. I said, we've got the mousetrap here that cities around the world are trying to copy. They're all coming to Harvard Square, Kendall Square, whatever, MIT. How can we learn and bring this back to our cities, our countries? They've been doing this for decades now. So we've figured out a way to do it, which is great. I don't think we're just going to lose it overnight because of an uncooperative federal government. But the cost of living is a real problem for it. It's a big problem for California. It's a big problem for New York. I've been noticing that housing costs are going down, slipping in other parts of the country, but on the coasts, they're still too high. So you have to build more housing. And I think there's a big discussion on that. It's my key issue. It's been my key issue for years now. That Boston has to find a way to do it, and the state can help. Um, I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to get into a housing discussion, which I could get. I'm on the zone, the planning board in Newton, so I kind of know something about it.
Well, I guess I just have to ask one follow-up question. Maybe folks in the audience will ask others. I mean, one is just that, there tends to be a lot of NIMBYism within 128 anytime somebody says, let's build an apartment complex. And also the other thing, which I heard sort of recently, is there's a couple of startup companies that are looking again at factory built housing in central Massachusetts where like, hey, let's put together a 1,500 square foot house in a factory and then we'll ship it to Somerville and put it on a lot. And the construction unions hate that idea because everything needs to be stick built by them, in Boston, Cambridge, Somerville.
The state that passed this MBTA Communities Act, basically forcing communities to zone for multifamily housing within a half a mile of transit stations. It's been really important. Many communities have had to change the zoning, but that doesn't necessarily lead to housing. Then you still have to have the financing, the cost of construction is still high, the cost of land is still high. And so, but I think that that's been an important step. I think more steps need to be taken.
Yeah.
That's an
Yeah.
important step, though.
All right.
I was chair of the Massachusetts State Zoning Reform Working Group for 15 years, and we batted our head against the wall on this subject year after year after year. So I kind of know that topic.
Yeah.
So the MBTA Communities Act was a major breakthrough for this state to tell communities you have to do this.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I would observe, just one more note on housing, is like when I lived in San Francisco for a couple of years, they really had kind of unlocked the like accessory dwelling units, like the granny apartments in the backyard. And like you looked around and yeah, there were a lot of houses that were $750,000, $1 million single family houses, but they had built these small rental units in the backyard. And it feels like that's coming and people want that to happen in the greater Boston area.
Again, this MBTA Communities Act makes that by right in every community in the state.
Yeah.
You have to allow it. It isn't anymore up to the town to do it. I don't know. People are kind of thinking, oh, geez, so I want a little 750 room uh, square foot thing in my backyard. I don't
Yeah,
know. I don't know.
generates a little extra rent.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll see.
The next thing, what about transportation and traffic? I mean, one of the things, um, I'm I think this is a stat that I saw in your book about MBTA ridership is still really at like 58 or 60% of where it was before
For the
COVID.
subways,
This for the subways. Commuter rail has kind of bounced back
almost all
more.
the way back, and the
Yeah,
buses are up
and
there too.
buses are back. Is there like an Uber and Lyft effect there with the subway where just people opted out of it during COVID and they haven't returned?
Yeah, I mean, people are still taking the subway, and I mean, and the thing is, I think the service, that's the best thing that's happened to Boston or Massachusetts. That we have Phil Lang, who came here from New York, and is a serious operational guy who's really trying to improve the service. He's not some think tank guy, not some finance guy, but a guy who wants to really ride the subways and make
Hmm.
them work.
Yeah.
So he's done a good job.
But what do you think it takes to kind of win people back to the
I don't
subways
know.
if they have said like, oh, Uber is a pretty convenient way to get to work,
Well, I think
or Blue Bikes or whatever they've kind of
But
opted
the
out
thing is
for?
too, there's always be people working downtown who need to take the subways on a
Yeah.
daily basis, and
Hmm.
that's a lot of it.
Yeah. Should we
I
talk?
don't think it's that they hate because you can't drive downtown every day and commute there.
Yeah.
Forget it, because
Yeah.
then you have to park your car, and that's a fortune.
Yeah. Could we talk about that issue a little bit? I mean, the era that you write about in the book is very much that era of the 5 day a week in the office. It's kind of what created Kendall Square. It's what created downtown Boston. It's what was starting to create the Seaport Business District with a lot of companies down there. Um, and have you heard anybody say anything intelligent recently about what brings back office usage, what brings back lab
It
space?
looks like, a lot of employers are now saying at least 3 days a week. If you've ever been, going to town now, you could probably drive into town easier on a Monday than you can on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. And taking the commuter rail Fridays, hey, you work from home, you work remotely, that's okay.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting, the high tech places. I think Amazon, which has thousands of people working here, they want people to be in the office. So this is high tech where you can work remotely, and they want to have uh, the bump and connect that you and
Bob Krim, your
Trim,
fellow Newtonite
Bob
coined that
Trim
term.
has talked
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
Can I see the show of hands, like people in the room who have a 5 day a week in office job right now? All right, a couple. Is that voluntary or you're forced? The four of you are forced to be in the office 5 days a week? Yeah, pretty much. I always like to tell the story of going to Spotify's Boston office, the music streaming service, which is right across from City Hall. And what they were doing to try to convince people to come in on, I think it was like Wednesday, is free lunch on Wednesday. And so everybody would come in from all around the greater Boston area on Wednesday for lunch. And I happened to visit at like 2 p.m. And there was a post-lunch exodus of everybody leaving at 2:15 to try to beat the traffic. So like they solved the problem for at least part of one workday.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'd like to talk about, it is about immigration. I'd just like to highlight a few things about the immigration situation. Since 1990, 90% of the increase in population of Massachusetts has come from foreign-born people. People aren't, and these are not people necessarily moving here from Europe, but other parts of the world. People are not moving here in great droves, coming here from Texas or coming here from Colorado or Arizona, but they're coming from foreign countries. Um, Another really interesting thing, this is really hard to believe, that 43% of foreign-born people in Massachusetts have at least a bachelor's degree. So you've got this bifurcated thing. You talk about inequality. If they got a bachelor's degree, maybe they have more than that, a very well-paying job, but that is a little more than half don't. And these are people who come, and these are definitely less resources. People, hey, they're doing important jobs. They're running restaurants and they're landscaping, and but they aren't getting paid that much. That's a real problem. They don't get paid for the value they put in, and I think it's really important to value the people, the home care, the child care, all those jobs. But it is fascinating to think that there's so much real educated talent coming here. 25% of biotech company founders are foreign born here. So it's really, this has been a real magnet for people from all income levels, all education levels, all over the world. And that has been, imagine what would we be without that if we didn't have people coming from, Latin America, East Asia,
Yeah. Well,
et cetera.
and the thing that is very worrisome to me, and like maybe I'm, just inclined as a journalist to worry about stuff all the time, is just I'm going to a conference next week, and it's a lot of, it's a lot of biotech entrepreneurs from outside the U.S. who have come here to get PhDs. And one of the topics they're talking about this conference is like, what are the new centers of biotech? So basically, if you can't easily stay here and get a visa to stay and start a company, where do you go? Do you go to
Okay.
Singapore? Do you go to Cambridge, UK?
That's right.
Do you go to Switzerland?
Right. And that's a real major question, one which I try to explain in this book, and I think it's important for all of us to take home. You were talking about inequality. I don't think the way to deal with it is to be scaring off people who maybe are making $250,000 because they're doing incredible work. Mass Bio, which is Mass Biotechnology Council, the kind of lead trade agency, from their research, they say that every job in biotech, there are about 110,000 people working in biotech, every job creates 8 other jobs, 8 other barbers, landscapers, doctors, attorneys. The spin-off is tremendous. And then you kind of see the federal government say, our Secretary of Health and Human Services saying, oh, we aren't going to fund messenger RNA anymore because we think that's unsafe. Moderna, which pioneered this in COVID vaccine, they've had over 2 billion uh, doses delivered worldwide, and it looks like it's done a pretty good job to me. So stuff like that is really kind of off the wall, and we'll see. I know that they're, cutting back a lot of people with Moderna. So I'm definitely pro innovation for sure, pro higher education, pro high tech, but also, working very hard to make sure that everybody who's doing everything else is valued for their contributions as
Mm-hmm.
well.
I would love to open it up to your questions in just a minute, so get your questions ready. I guess maybe the last thing I would ask you, since you mentioned Governor Healy, um, maybe a two-part question. Talk about in the book, are there ways that elected officials actually have been forces for good over the last couple decades in terms of setting us up to be a successful global city? And is there anything you would say to Governor Healy at this particular juncture about, hey, here's what we really should be focused on as we kind of, enter this kind of unknown chapter?
Well, definitely Governor Patrick, Charlie Baker, and Healy. I think they all get it on supporting technology. We complain about politics, but I think Massachusetts and Boston has been blessed with a lot of pretty good leadership. I mean, you look at the city of Boston for mayors. I think you go back to John Collins. You can go back to John Hines before that. Since James Michael Curley, Boston has always had pretty sound mayors, and it's given pretty good leadership. So that's kind of amazing. A lot of cities, I don't think New York's had that situation, for instance. I don't think Chicago's a different case because they had two guys named Daley who were mayor together for 50 years. So that's a different kind of place. But um, so Boston, I think, has been blessed with pretty sensitive political leadership on these issues. I do think the legislature does lag with stuff. It was so hard to get them to. I knocked my head against the wall. I said for 15, maybe it's 18 years, going up there every 2 years with new bills we'd be promoting for zoning reform, and they would do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
The House Speaker would just let it slide the next time. And then finally, Charlie Baker, who had been governor for 2 terms, had to slip it into this economic bond bill, the thing about the zoning reform changes. Just slip
Yeah.
it in there, and they had to go along with
Well,
it.
and you also mentioned this proposal from a week or two ago to put $400 million into supporting all the great academic research that happens here. And that, I think, is a proposal to the legislature that, like, hey, let's figure out where $400 million might come from, as opposed to like a check that you've written out, right? So we still need to get get
Yeah.
over that hurdle.
Yeah.
Questions from all of you, and you want to be brief. I'll try to repeat it for
Global cities tend to have very strong global partners. What's Boston?
global partners.
Global partners.
There's the official Sister Cities program, and I don't think Boston does much with that. Other cities do. But there's all kinds of fascinating studies, and that's how I really got into this book, going down looking at other cities. And there's one study that looks at our connections through business services. That's legal services, finance, marketing, advertising, whatever, accounting. Yeah, obviously, New York is number one. Um, but as a few years ago, definitely San Francisco is number two. But Hong Kong was like number five. And don't even ask me. They don't explain what the connections have been. Um, but just being, I think Tel Aviv, the boss has a close connection to that. Israel, I mean, the story is in Israel, or, kind of a certain kind of story. But I think a lot of people have missed how important their innovation economy has been in Israel over the last couple of decades. And Boston is closely tied with them. So those are places where there are connections. Um, Boston, what it does, the great rankings that it has in these studies isn't just the United States, but globally. It's in the top 10 for innovation cities. Up there in this country with San Francisco, Seattle, um, San Diego for biotech. New York and LA are also playing strong, but places like uh, Amsterdam, London, and China. China is going like gangbusters. They aren't just making plastic toys anymore. They are investing big time in every kind of scientific innovation.
Great question. Yes, in the middle there.
In the history of Boston, I'm wondering why there was never an effort to incorporate a lot of the individuals now to Boston. I mean, it's typical metropolitan area, so much bigger than Boston itself, and Boston is quite a place. But why?
Okay,
Let me just repeat that. So it's a question about why did Boston not annex a lot of the other towns and become a bigger metropolitan area? Why do we have all these tiny little towns like Brookline and Newton that think they're cities?
Newton is a city, but they think it's 13 villages. That's my biggest criticism of Newton. Oh, we're a village here. Um, that's Boston, for a major city of the 25 biggest metropolitan areas. Boston has the city of Boston has the smallest geographical area. It's small because all those other places, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, of course, is enormous. New York, combined the five boroughs, everything. So Boston never did, and it's Brookline, which was the culprit back in the 1870s, because up till you might not realize it, but Roxbury was a separate community, Charlestown, Brighton, these were all Dorchester, they were all separate. They were all absorbed. They all joined Boston in the 1850s, 1860s. But then once Brookline said that's it, Newton was thinking of doing it. They said, oh, maybe we ought to stay just Newton. Cambridge, they could have been taken. No, they were thinking of joining Boston about 1870. But after Brookline said, in Brookline, they tried to get it through 3 times in Brookline, got voted down at town meeting every time. So, and that was it. And it is kind of makes it harder for us to kind of organize. Uh, we don't have a regional government really, but actually the state does an okay job, even though I think the legislature doesn't always do an okay job.
That's a great question. I had actually learned something about Brookline that I never knew. Yes, over here.
Does beauty, art, culture play a role in making a global city, or is it primarily economic?
Excellent
Beauty,
question.
art, culture play a role in making something a global city.
Absolutely. You can do it strictly from an economic point of view, that because if you do have the cultural activities, and we do have world class, they are, whether it's the Boston Symphony and the terrible. I was going to turn this off, but I said nobody calls me.
You want me to pick it up? I'll tell them you should be here.
Turn it off. Turn it off. I said nobody calls me. My wife says, you don't check your text. I say nobody texts me. Okay, but absolutely, it attracts people here. It's always been part of the brand of Boston. In cities in general. It's kind of a funny thing. There are a couple ways of slicing the global cities thing. It's one, it's reputation, which I do discuss. I have a whole chapter in here, reputation, Boston's role in the world and how it's perceived, and some funny stuff about what happened to the Olympics a decade ago and how Boston's going to have a World's Fair for the bicentennial 50 years ago and how that didn't come out, and all the different things where Boston tried to be global and didn't quite turn out. But how much is it the reputation and how much of it is the actual interactions with the rest of the world? So in that, what are our connections? The connections through telecommunications, through transportation, through airlines, what are through supply chains. I've got a whole chapter in here on supply chains, which we didn't get into, which I think are really critical, really interesting, because one of my, you say, what am I interested in writing books? Definitely untold stories, but also how do things work? In meaning here, how does a region, how does a metropolitan area work? So you got to look at, how it developed spatially in my book, The Hub's Metropolis, and here, how does it develop as a place more economically? But definitely, the arts, culture is critical. That's our brand. You go to any place in America, any place in the world, and that's a place of education. All these crazy surveys, which I don't always go along with, if you will. What is always the top university in the world? It's ridiculous. So how can we kind of like bring them to heel? MIT. MIT. I just looking at some numbers today. Do you know how many? It's like several trillion dollars um, has been made by companies spun off from students
think
or
someone did the
faculty at
math and
MIT.
they were like, if all of the MIT founded companies were a nation, it would be like number 17 on
10,
GDP.
10. I was looking today. It was 10th.
10,
10th.
yeah.
It would be 10th in the world of its own GOP. And these are just professors and students from MIT. That's MIT, not Harvard, BU.
Yeah,
Tough.
Tufts isn't a slouch over there.
So it's like,
Somerville.
so that's really
Medford.
meaningful stuff.
Um, Yeah, it's funny, on the Olympics stuff and us deciding we didn't want to host the 2024 Olympics and World's Fairs. I was with somebody from the Wu administration last year, and you could tell that they're thinking about like, well, what is the biggest event you could host in Boston without provoking backlash like the Olympics? Like they were talking about World's Fairs, and they were doing some research into like whatever happened to World's Fairs. Could we bring those back in the U.S.? And then clearly with the World Cup next year, which isn't really going to be in the city of Boston, but everybody is very excited about the economic development that will potentially bring.
Yeah, that isn't the same because they're going to have it in what?
Foxborough?
10 or 12
yeah,
North American cities.
Yeah.
So and they're playing up. They're saying it's going to be billions going to bring it in. I don't know. I'm kind of skeptical.
Yeah, I just think there is that interesting thing with Boston where it's like, well, how big can you do something without provoking that backlash of, oh, this is going to bring too many people or too much,
Well, let me just talk about this
infrastructure.
World's Fair story, late 60s. They're excited about the bicentennial. Who knows about this? Just raise your hand. Who knows about this World's Fair? So they had this plan, and they were vying with Philadelphia to see who would do the World's Fair. In the end, Nixon was president. He just said, screw it, leave to every town to do it. Maybe that was wise. So they were going to have this big thing down where you have UMass Boston today, Columbia Point, and they were going to have islands, the Boston Harbor Island, before they had anything to do with National Park Service. And they were going to put it on the island. It's going to be sustainable, right? But it's kind of South Boston. So this is late 60s, South Boston. They thought, well, what happens when the World's Fair is over? And they said, well, we're going to reuse the buildings and have people live there. So they said, well, who's going to live in the buildings down in South Boston? So with that, I think it lost in the city council. There might have been one councilor who voted for the World's Fair to go forward with the application because they were afraid of
who might move
who
into those buildings
who isn't
afterwards.
from the South Boston neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could write a.
So that's another story
Right.
different from the
Well,
Olympics of a decade ago.
yeah, and since you mentioned Columbia Point and the JFK Library over there, there was a plan to put the JFK Presidential Library in Harvard Square,
Right over here, right.
So there could be a whole other book about things that were shot down in the
Right,
Boston area
right.
over the years. I'd love to take a couple more questions. Yeah.
In my mind, an archetype of local city is Harlem. A month ago, I was in Chicago, walking north and south from the loop. I was constantly surrounded by buildings, 10 stories or taller, both residential, mixed use, etc. I currently live in Chinatown, where I'm surrounded by tall buildings. However, I can walk south half a mile, and those tall buildings are gone. And any new development, either Southie or Walkingdale, or Make the Plains, new development, they're constantly, it seems to me that they're capped at 4 or 5 stories, or there's these like luxury duplexes, triplexes that were converted to old homes. So my question is, why don't we build taller? When is that archetype valid?
Why don't we build taller in Boston like
Oh,
they do in Chicago?
yeah, I go for that. Uh, well, oddly enough, if you go back to the 70s of Brookline, and I think that this kind of turned people off to it, you come up Beacon Street, and you see a lot of these kind of concrete buildings, modern buildings, and they're way more than 4 or 5 stories. There could be 12, 15 stories. They're all pretty big buildings. And then somehow people were building like that through the 70s, and then after that, they now it's got to be 4 or 5 stories. And oh my
But
God.
you're talking about like, why don't we have 70 or 70, 80, 100-story buildings?
Maybe a 10, 10 story.
Right. But it doesn't, but more than 4 or 5 stories, which seems to be, it's really interesting though. Cambridge passed this zoning law this year, and people might know about it since we're in Cambridge. And what is it? It's kind of like it ends single family zoning. It's like any place in Cambridge, not just certain zones, you could build at least 6 stories, I think. That's kind of amazing. But that's the thing about Boston. Boston is Boston. It's this metropolitan area with the 101 cities and towns and MAPC, Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Um, and it is what it is. It isn't Chicago. Hey, I love Chicago myself. I was there this year. It's fantastic. It's the greatest city you can imagine. But Boston has got the scale, which is just a smaller scale, but it's a more neighborly, it's more a little more provincial, but it's more comfortable. I think it's a more livable city. Whereas,
And they are building in Kendall Square. I forget how many stories it is. Like what's going to be the tallest building in Cambridge is under construction
yeah,
now
right,
on Broadway.
yeah,
So some of that's happening.
I was also thinking of like Davis Square, which has been revamped there over the last 5, 6 years. They just extended the Green Line, the road. If anyone lived there, it was a mess during the pandemic. And now they have this one massive tower that kind of looks out of place considering there are all of these, 5, 6 story buildings around it. I forget how tall that tower is. My question is though, and it seems like literally that entire area, 40 between Somerville and Cambridge, is changing. Where they're starting to build those, 12, 15
right.
story buildings. My question is, maybe it's something for the public to ask themselves. Shouldn't we incentivize to build taller? That way we have more housing because you can get the same square footage
Right.
per unit.
I do wonder if that's going to be a transition that we see, though. A lot of the tall buildings that have been built, like in Cambridge Crossing, that neighborhood you're talking about near Lechmere, or the tall building that was built in Union Square, Somerville, were posited on. This is going to be a biotech lab building, and
Right.
Bristol Myers Squibb is going to fill it, or other biotechs are going to fill it. And if they weren't building housing, they were building really expensive lab space. So I wonder if we're going to see that kind of transition in what gets built in Boston and Cambridge soon.
Yeah. Well, and also in the downtown, you've got the mayor and her planning department under Cairo Shen. They like to do rezoning the downtown, allowing a lot of 700-foot buildings, and of course, there's a lot of opposition to that. It's not going through that easily. And I think we're all concerned about maintaining the historic fabric too.
Yes, that is always a concern around here. Let's take a couple last questions. Yeah, here.
I want to build on the question from across the room about communities not being connected to Boston. You're thinking about how we have this intense local control, dating back to the Puritans and so on got here, and yet we became a global city. And that seems in contrast. How do you have this intense local control and somehow become a global city? So I'm curious how you think about that dichotomy of heavy local control leading to somebody becoming a global city. It seems like it would be the opposite outcome.
Well, it's kind of interesting. In Cambridge, here we are. This is ground zero. So why do you have this as this biotech capital of the world? As you might recall, they had urban renewal over in Kendall Square back in the 60s, and they had urban renewal everywhere. Urban renewal in cities across the country. You have to realize that Cambridge did have these really good universities back in the 1960s, but they didn't have the global role that they have today. So they had all this open space. Then they were going to have NASA was going to have a facility here, and nix that. Um, so then gradually you had biotech growing, and all of a sudden you had all this open land that the city was more than happy to just turn over to these companies over years, the 80s, the 90s. It happened right next to MIT. It was one of those lucky, we had a lot of fiascos, but that was like the luckiest thing in the world that could have happened to greater Boston. It's kind of funny. We call it Boston, but I do have a chapter in my book calling it the Cambridge Boston innovation sector because you really have to think of it that way. You have, and
That's why this event is in Cambridge, right? Not at the Trident Books. Yeah.
right.
I do think it's interesting, like, there's a little bit of a story that I think you touch on in the book about the early days of biotech, and when the city of Cambridge looked at it, there was a mayor named Al Bellucci, who nobody here is old enough to remember Al Bellucci. Yeah, some people are. Who was very like both anti-Harvard and worried about the biotech industry, and he tried to shut it down and basically say you can't do this sort of work in Cambridge. They wound up creating a committee that said we're going to create guidelines of how you do it safely. And Cambridge did that before Boston did it. And so
Before any city in America.
and any other city in America, but there are interesting stories of people who were trying to start biotech companies there will tell you we rented space in Boston and there would be protests outside of our building. Ray Flynn, before he was mayor, led some of these protests against biotech companies being in Boston. And so, like, that's an interesting example to me of this weird factional region that we are. Like, Cambridge got it right, Boston got it wrong. Somerville, I don't think, did anything around biotech legislation, and then so you get all these companies.
I was going to say about biotech. Um, I don't know. It slipped my mind.
Which is, do you think local control allowed that experimentation and actually allowed us to become the global city? So
No, I think it's kind of just happened. It's with irrelevant to zoning. But the interesting thing is about this exercise that Cambridge went through to come up with these world breaking or shaping guidelines for biotech. They had this committee do it in 3 months. Could you imagine? You think it would take, they could get it done in 3 months today? They'd be arguing about it for 10 years, right?
Yeah,
In Cambridge or anywhere. You name your town. How did they do it? I have no idea.
yeah, it was fast.
It was fast.
Let's see. I think there were a couple other questions we'll get to. How about all the way in the back? Yeah.
I have a multi-part question. I'll be brief in this time and time. I'm really kind of interested in exploring what you do from the economic development. For instance, about cost regression and cost regionalization systems, brain circulation is part of what made it globalized. And people from all over the world and they can develop the supply chain.
Absolutely. I really addressed that. No, that's what this book's about.
A more appropriate point. You brought the contribution of public. So at one point, thousands of years later, the graduates had fallen. So I wonder, the reason one level research.
Yeah. Well, just your initial point on these clusters, industries, and that's what really drives economic development. And we know that cities everywhere in this country or any country have certain specialties that they develop. Um, Boston, as I said, was the pioneer of the Industrial Revolution in America when it started with textile manufacturing back in the 18 teens. You know, when they were here's politics, right? They get involved with the War of 1812 with England. Oh, that isn't too good. That's screwing up all the shipping, the mercantile work, and France. They're in between those two places. So they say, geez, we can't do the China trade, the India trade, the Argentina trade, or whatever. Well, let's copy what they've got over. If you know the story, let's copy England start this industrial revolution with these textile mills. So a guy named Francis Lowell goes over there. It's illegal to take out any papers or plans that kind of show how the machinery works. So he memorizes the whole thing in his head, brings it back, and replicates what they're doing in Manchester, England. Starts in Waltham and then does it in Lowell. So that you talk about a crazy break. You talk about crazy politics that force a lot of these things, which are just odd little things that happen. That's an odd little thing that happened, and then all the money that comes out of it. Just like the biotech and Mayor Vellucci, and then the urban renewal over in Kendall Square, kind of becoming the seeds for biotech. It's really hard. Other countries are saying, how do we emulate this? Well, you have to get a little lucky once in a while.
And I think people always mention Harvard and MIT just because they're the two schools that, Harvard's been around for a little while now. MIT gets some has some pretty smart graduates here and there. But I mean, you can find other examples of like if you've ever gotten prescription drugs from Amazon, they bought a company here called PillPack that was founded by a guy from Mass College of Pharmacy. Like that's not a school that people mention along with Harvard, MIT, and Tufts very often. And for public universities, I like to tell the story of why is Google here in the Boston area? It's because of a UMass Lowell guy named Rich Miner, who lives a couple blocks from here in Cambridge, who co-founded Android. When Google wanted to get into the mobile phone business, they bought that company, and he kind of became a power player within Google and said, "Hey, there's lots of other smart people you could hire in Cambridge. We should start an outpost here." So I definitely would say that you know they've been founders, folks from public universities, and they also have been a huge part of the workforce for a lot of these companies.
I'd just like to say one more thing about innovation. How many of you had ever been to an event at the Cambridge Innovation Center over in Kendall Square? Every Thursday night, they have a cafe year round. It's free, and you have to register ahead of time. And this is the amazing. They have talks, different things every Thursday night, AI, biotech, whatever. And they do give you 3 free drinks. Not 2. My wife says, "Oh my God, Jim, don't worry, I'll only have one, Anne-Marie, before I drive home." um, but this Ray Miner, he started, he was like a one-man shop, started with Google, and he was at this Cambridge Innovation Center, which, a company could take a number of spaces or desks or whatever. Just if you ever go there, especially during the day, it's just the people at desks working, or they're all lined up, drinking their coffee. And that's what he started as, working over there, kind of this beachhead for Google, which now is what, 2,000 employees around Boston.
Yeah,
And
definitely worth checking out. It's called Venture Cafe. The thing they
yeah,
do pretty much every Thursday of the year. They might take an August Thursday off.
yeah,
They sometimes take a December Thursday
yeah.
off.
And the other thing is they've got branches of this Cambridge Innovation Center in places like Tokyo, Warsaw, Lisbon, St. Louis. I mean, again, Cambridge Innovation Center. That's what they want around the world.
Yeah, I think Seoul is next. I ran into the
Okay.
founder at the grocery store in Kendall Square.
Okay, there you
He said
go.
Seoul wants a new innovation center. Let's see, was there one more question? Yes, give you the last shot.
Well, pressure. You mentioned you pressed a couple times in the question of urban renewal. There's been a recent game, certainly in New York, about Robert Moses so vilified, and yet some of the urban renewal may have helped set the stage for New York rising after the financial crisis. So I'm curious your thoughts on some of the work at Logue and some of the work that's done in urban renewal in Boston, and what role it played in the making of the renewal of Boston as a.
Yeah, important question. Um, Actually, I'm going to be giving a walking tour of Government Center in the West End for the Newton Community Ed organization the first Sunday in November. So they give walking tours, Newton Community Ed. And I think it was critical. Boston was a real, and I have to emphasize this so much. Boston was a real stagnating place, kind of 30s, really stagnating during the Depression. World War II was kind of a bump. 50s, no investment in the city, a real aging city, not built for the automobile. And they said, we've got to regenerate investment in Boston. The private sector would not invest. They distrusted the Irish politicians. So they said the only way we could do it is to get government to do it. We need a new city hall. We'll get the state to build some new office buildings. We'll get the feds to do it. And we'll do this government center. West End is a completely different story. So, and then with that, we'll hope that the private sector follows with investment. Well, if the city hall opens in 1968, the next year, this building at the corner of Congress and State, I forget what it is today, what it's called. It was started the next year. And then it went from there. And then you look at the 70s, you've got all these high rises that get built across the financial district after that. So it really does kickstart and makes people believe in Boston. And Boston's not just some quaint old place, but Boston is a modern place. I just have to close with this one here. In 1976, the American Institute of Architects, this is for the bicentennial, they polled architects on the best buildings in American history, and City Hall came in number 6. There were 3 Thomas Jefferson buildings ahead of it, like University of Virginia, Monticello, and the Virginia State Capitol, and I forget what the others were. So people really bought it. People thought that Boston is modern. Boston is cool. Boston is hip. Um, so it was important. West End was the textbook example of bad urban renewal, and City Hall Plaza was really worse than the City Hall itself. Um, but
We're still trying to fix it.
yeah,
Every 5 years,
they're working
they're
on it. They're
doing
working.
the,
They built in trees.
Right. Let's have a roller rink and celebrate Donna Summer once a summer. That's gonna do it. Well, I have to say, we could keep talking because we haven't really even touched on the seaport, right? Which is like a whole new downtown area or new urban area that was created really in the last 25 years or so. But the thing that's so great about the book and what I enjoyed about reading it is that you're talking about these prior eras, but everything feels just so connected to the city
Right.
that we're living in today, and it
Yeah.
raises so many questions. I think about the future
Yeah.
of Boston, which is
Yeah.
always exciting. I want to thank you for all the great questions. I want to thank Jim for all the great answers. And our goal, is to sell out the Harvard Bookstore stock this book and get them signed. Jim has the Sharpies up here. And one more time, thanks to Jude and the team at Harvard Bookstore for putting this event together.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim and Scott, for joining us tonight. If you have not already purchased your copy, Boston, the Making of a Global City is available for sale.
I hate these. I'm gonna do a pen. I can't.
Here, make your way towards the door.
This one, yeah, it'll be better.